People ask me, now that I am old enough to be asked things, what it takes to stand still for a living. They expect me to talk about the legs, the heat under the bearskin, the ache that sets into a man's shoulders by the third hour. Those things are real and I could fill an evening with them. But that is not the answer. The answer is that you learn to disappear without leaving. You learn to let the room forget you are in it. And once a room has forgotten you, it will say things in front of you that it would never say to your face. I spent the better part of my life learning that trade twice. The first time was in the field, long before I ever wore red wool, when I was a young man whose whole purpose was to lie in a fold of cold ground and watch a thing for 2 days and 3 nights without moving and without being seen, and then to come back and tell my officers exactly what I had observed. Every man, every cart, every changing of a sentry, the hour the lamps were lit, the hour they went dark. I was not a fighter, not chiefly. I was an observer. My commanders used to say I had a memory like wet plaster. You pressed a thing into it once and it's set forever. I did not think it a gift at the time. It only meant I forgot nothing, including the things a man would give a year of his life to forget. The second time I learned to disappear was in the long gallery of Wenlock Palace, on the night door of the king's cabinet, in the years when our old king's health was failing, and the kingdom of Callanmore was quietly holding its breath. I want to set the scene plainly, the way I would have reported it, because I think the plainness is the whole point of what follows. The cabinet was a small, rich room at the head of the west stair, where the king kept his private papers and met the few men he trusted without ceremony. The door was tall, white-tanned gold, with a brass handle worn pale by a century of hands. My post was 3 paces to the left of it, in the corridor we called the Long Gallery, 100 feet of polished floor, dark portraits of dead Marins in their frames, tall windows that showed nothing at night but the black shapes of the gardens, and far off, the river. I stood the late watch there, the dead watch, from the 11th hour until the gray of dawn, 4 nights out of 7. I wore the dress of the household guard, the same a man wears on the gate where the tourists gather, though no tourist ever saw me. Red wool tunic, brass buttons that I kept like little mirrors, the tall black bearskin, white gloves, my rifle at my shoulder, which in that corridor was more a thing of honor than of use. I stood with my eyes forward, my chin against the strap, and I did not move. That was the post. To stand at the king's last private door through the small hours and be, in my person, a promise that some things in the realm were still held, still watched, still kept. I tell you all this so you understand what the Lord High Steward saw when he looked at me. He did not see a man named Thomas Wren, who had once spent 3 winters lying in the heather counting other men's lamps. He saw a fixture. He saw a thing the palace had put there the way it put a clock on the wall or a suit of old armor at the turn of the stair. He saw furniture. I do not say that bitterly. I say it because it was true, and because his being so completely right about how I looked was the exact reason he was so completely undone by what I was. His name was Sebastian Crail, Lord High Steward of the household, which is to say the man who ran the whole machine of the palace beneath the king. The money, the keys, the keeping of the seals, the comings and goings of every soul who served. He was perhaps 50, tall, with a long, clean face and gray at his temples, and the kind of voice that had never once in his life needed to be raised to be obeyed. He dressed beautifully. He moved through the palace as if the floors had been laid for the particular pleasure of his feet. And he had decided, somewhere along the way, that the world divided into people who mattered and people who were the furnishings of the lives of people who mattered. He let me know which I was on the first night I ever stood his way. He came up the west stair near midnight with a candle and a folio under his arm, and he stopped in front of me, and he looked me up and down the way a man looks at a chair he is deciding whether to have recovered. "Stand straighter," he said. "You're slouching. The king doesn't pay you to wilt." I was not slouching. A man who has held a firing position for 2 days knows precisely where his spine is at all times. But it is not the place of the night guard to argue with the Lord High Steward, and besides, I had long since stopped needing to win small arguments. I straightened the half-inch he wanted and I said nothing, and I kept my eyes forward, and he made a small sound in his throat that I came to know very well in the months after, a little exhale of satisfaction, the sound of a man pleased to have been obeyed by an object. "Good," he said. "Now do everyone the courtesy of being scenery." He went into the cabinet. I heard the brass handle turn and the door close and the small click of the bolt. I want to be honest about how that landed. A younger man, a prouder one, might have burned over it. I had been a younger man and I had burned over smaller things. But the field had taken that out of me. When your work is to be unseen, an insult that proves you are unseen is not an injury. It is a report. It told me something about Sebastian Crail that I filed away the way I had once filed the hour a century changed. He believed the furniture could not see him. And a man who believes that will eventually do, in front of the furniture, the very thing he would die to keep hidden. So I stood my post, and I became scenery and I watched. For a long while there was nothing to watch but the ordinary tide of a palace at night. The king's physician coming and going at odd hours, his face a little graver each week, because our old king was failing and we all knew it and none of us said it aloud. The lamplighter. The night clerk, old Mr. Pell, shuffling up the stair with the day's papers to be locked away, stopping each time to nod at me and say, "Cold one, Sergeant," whether it was cold or not, because that was his way of being kind to a man he thought had a lonely job. I will come back to Mr. Pell. He matters more than almost anyone in this. And the Lord High Steward, of course, coming and going from the cabinet with his folios and his candle, always at the dead hours, always treating me to some small reminder of what I was. Don't breathe so loud. Look at the wall, not at me. Once, when he had drunk a little, he stopped and rapped his knuckles twice against my breastbone, against the brass, the way you knock on a table to test the wood, and he laughed and said, "Solid, good, we'll keep you." And he went in. I have known men I'd have struck for less in another life. I let it go. It went into the wet plaster with everything else. The first wrong note came on a night near the turn of the year, and it was such a small thing that a man not trained as I had been would have let it slide past without a thought. It was past 2 in the morning. The king had been abed for hours. I had seen the physician leave at 11 with that grave face, and I knew, because I knew everything that passed that door, that His Majesty had not stirred from his bedchamber in the far wing in 3 days. He was too weak. That was simply a fact of those nights, as fixed as the portraits on the wall. And yet the Lord High Steward came up the stair near 2 with another man I did not know, a soft-footed, well-dressed stranger with a foreigner's cut to his coat, and they went into the cabinet, and they were in there above an hour. And when they came out, the stranger carried a folded paper, and I saw in the candlelight the unmistakable disk of red wax on it, pressed with the king's own privy seal, the small seal His Majesty kept on his person, that left his bedchamber only on his own hand. The king had not left his bedchamber in 3 days. That was the wrong note. A document had gone out of that room under the king's privy seal on a night the king had not been near it. It is the kind of thing a tired man tells himself he has misremembered. But I do not misremember. That is the one thing I have always been able to say of myself without pride or shame. I do not misremember. The plaster had set. The king was abed. The seal had been used. The two facts would not lie down together. I did not move. I did not change my face. I stood scenery, and I watched the foreigner go down the west stair with the sealed paper in his breast, and I watched the Lord High Steward turn at the door and look at me, and for 1/2 of 1 second I saw him check. I saw him glance at me the way a man glances back at a dog he is not quite sure is asleep. And then he remembered what I was, and the half-second passed, and he smiled his thin smile. "Long night, isn't it?" he said. It was not a question. "Mind you stay awake, we wouldn't want the furniture nodding off." "No, my lord," I said. It was the first thing I had ever said to him. He looked faintly surprised that I could speak at all, and then he forgot it, and he went away down the stair, and I was alone in the long gallery with the dead Marins in their frames and the new, cold weight of a thing I now knew that I should not have known. I would like to tell you that I went straight to someone the next morning. I did not, and I want to explain why, because the not going is the part people understand least. Consider my position. I was a sergeant of the night guard. The man I would be accusing was the Lord High Steward of the household, the second most powerful man in the kingdom, perhaps the first, with the king so weak. I had no document, I had no witness. I had a memory, mine alone, of a seal on a paper and an empty bedchamber 3 corridors away. To whom does the furniture carry such a thing? To the steward's own clerks, who answered to him. To the provost marshal, who would, by every law of the household, refer such a charge against so great a man straight back to the steward's office to be examined. I would have been laughed out the gate by noon, and quietly dismissed by night, and the only man in Wenlock Palace who knew where to look would have been put out the door with no character and no proof. Worse, Crail would have known, and a man who would forge his dying king's hand would not leave loose a sergeant who had named him. I had learned a hard discipline in the field, the hardest of all the disciplines, harder than the cold and the stillness, the discipline of seeing a thing and not acting on it, of lying in the heather and watching a column of men march into an ambush you cannot warn against without giving away the greater mission and getting 100 of your own killed. You learn that there are times when the only honorable thing, the only thing that serves the larger duty, is to keep your eyes open and your mouth shut and your hands still, and to gather, and to wait for the one moment when what you have seen can be made to count. So that is what I did. I made myself, deliberately and completely, into the most attentive piece of furniture in the kingdom. The months that followed were the strangest of my service. I stood my post 4 nights out of 7, and I watched the slow architecture of a betrayal go up around me, and I let it be built, because a half-built thing proves nothing and a finished thing, caught at the moment of its use, proves everything. I will give it to you the way I gathered it, in pieces, because that is how it came. The foreigner returned. Not always the same man, there were 2 of them across that winter, but the same soft tread, the same well-cut coats, the same dead hours. They came to the cabinet and they left with sealed papers, and twice more I marked the privy seal used on nights the king could not have held it. I did not need to read the papers. I am not a clever man with documents, but I did not have to be. I only had to do the one thing I had ever been good at, hold the dates. Who came? When? What they carried out. The state of the king, which I knew because I knew everything about that wing at night. The seals troubled me most, and one night I came to understand them. Crail had stayed late and alone, and through the door which he had left ajar, because why would the furniture matter, I heard the small, particular sounds of a man working with wax, the scrape of a knife, the brief soft hiss of a candle held to a stick of it, the firm press and the little exhale. And I understood that the privy seal that left the king's bedchamber on the king's hand was not the seal making those discs at all. Crail had a copy, a counterfeit matrix, cut by some craftsman in some back street, close enough to fool any man who did not have the genuine impression set in wet plaster behind his eyes, which I, as it happened, did, because old Mr. Pell had once, on a kind and idle night, shown me the day's sealed warrants and let me look my fill, never dreaming what he was filing away in me. The counterfeit was good, but it was not perfect. The genuine privy seal of the House of Marin had a small flaw in the border, a tiny break in the laurel where the matrix had chipped a generation before, on the lower left. The king's true seal carried that break. Crail's copy did not. I had seen both now in the same candlelight. I held them side by side in the wet plaster, and I knew, with the cold certainty of a man reporting a sentry's position, that every paper that foreigner carried into the night bore a false seal pressed by the Lord High Steward's own hand. I still had no document. Knowing a thing and holding a thing are different, and I had spent a life knowing things I could not hold. But I waited, and the chance came, as it always does to a patient man. It came in the form of a discarded draft. Crail was meticulous, but no man is meticulous at 3 in the morning at the end of a long winter. One night he came out of the cabinet in a temper. I had heard him within, low and sharp, arguing with one of the foreigners about money, about a sum that had not arrived, and in his temper he crumpled a sheet of paper and threw it, as a careless man does, toward the cold hearth at the end of the long gallery, and it fell short and lay against the wainscot in the dark, and he did not go back for it. He went down the stair muttering, and the foreigner went after him, and the corridor was empty. I did not move for an hour. That is the part no one believes. I stood my post for a full hour with that crumpled paper 4 paces from my boot, because the post does not end when the corridor empties, and because a guard found out of his place at 3 in the morning, retrieving a paper, is a guard with something to explain. So I waited until the dead hour was fully dead, until I was certain no one would come up that stair, and then, and only then, I stepped from my place. The first time in months I had broken my stillness for anything but the relief at the watch's end, and I took up the crumpled sheet, and I read it by the window's faint light. It was a draft of a letter, an instruction in a clerk's fair hand, directing the treasurer of the household to transfer the revenues of 3 of the crown's eastern estates into the keeping of an agent abroad, by his Majesty's express and private will, and to make no record of it in the public books. It was unsigned and unsealed. It was the working draft, the one a man scribbles and corrects before the fair copy goes under the false wax. There were crossings out. There were 2 figures, one struck through and one written above it larger, and at the foot in a different hand, in Creel's own hand, which I knew from 100 notes I had seen him scrawl and hand to his clerks, there was a line of private instruction. Pell to be the one who carries it. If it is ever found, it is found in his keeping. I read that last line 3 times, though I needed to read it only once. Pell. Old Mr. Pell of the kind nods, who said, "Cold one," sergeant on the warm nights, who had shown me the warrants out of nothing but friendliness. Mr. Pell was to be the man left holding the treason if it ever came to light. Creel had built his whole scheme so that the rope, when it came, would go round the neck of the most harmless, honest man in the palace. I folded that draft into the lining of my tunic, against the brass, where no one searches a guard, and I went back to my place, and I stood the rest of the watch with my heart going like a drum and my face as still as the portraits. I had a thing in my hand now. Not enough, not yet, but a thing. And I understood, holding it, that the waiting was almost over, because a draft like that is written for a near purpose. Creel was moving. The slow architecture was nearly built. Somewhere close ahead was the moment he meant to bring it all to its use, and when a betrayal reaches its moment, that is precisely the moment it can be caught. I learned the shape of his plan by listening, over the last weeks, through that carelessly open door, the way I had once learned the shape of an enemy camp by lying in the dark and counting. The old king was dying. The physician's face had told us that for months, and now the whole palace knew it. And the king's heir was his sister's son, a young man, a man grown, I should say, near 30, called the Prince Edric, who had spent his years away from the court serving honestly in the kingdom's far provinces, and who was, by every account I ever heard, decent, plain-spoken, and entirely unprepared for the kind of men who wait at the top of stairs. Creel did not want Edric on the throne. An honest king would look at the books. An honest king would ask where the eastern revenues had gone. What Creel wanted was a regency, himself at the head of a council guiding, a discredited or delayed heir, and the wealth he had been bleeding abroad turned, when the moment came, into the means of making himself the true power behind a hollow crown. And the keystone of it, the thing he had been forging all winter, was a single instrument, a letter of the king's express private will, sealed with the false privy seal, declaring that his majesty in his last clear strength had named not his nephew but a council of regency led by his most trusted servant, the Lord High Steward, to hold the realm. With the king too weak to be questioned and soon to be past questioning at all, who would gainsay it? It would be produced before the Privy Council in the king's own name, under the king's own seal, in the hand of the king's own trusted clerk. Pell, who would be made to carry it, and who would be hanged for it the moment anyone thought to doubt it, while Krail stood clean and grieving at the front of the room. It was, I will grant the man, a beautiful piece of work. It needed only one thing to be perfect. It needed there to be no one in the world who knew that the king had not held his seal those nights, that the wax bore a false laurel, that the whole edifice rested on a forgery written at 3 in the morning by a careless, contemptuous man in front of a piece of furniture. There was one such person. He stood 3 paces to the left of the cabinet door, in red wool, with his eyes forward and his mouth shut, and a folded draft against the brass over his heart, waiting. The moment came on a gray morning in early spring, and it nearly went past me before I understood it had come. The old king died in the night. The bell in the chapel tower told the palace before the sun was up, a single slow note, over and over, that I heard from my post as I stood the last hour of my watch. I knew at once what it meant, and I knew at once that Krail's moment had come with it, because a forged will is only of use while the man it lies about is too dead to deny it, and not yet so long dead that the council has had time to think. The Privy Council was summoned for that very morning, to settle the realm's governance before the kingdom could so much as draw breath. They would meet in the council chamber at the far end of the same floor as my post, and I knew, I had heard Krail say it through the open door not 3 nights before, in his low, pleased voice, that he would produce the instrument there, before them all, in the first raw hour of grief, when men are least inclined to doubt and most inclined to be led. I came off my watch at the changing of the guard with the dawn, and by every rule of the service I should have gone to my quarters and slept. Instead, I did the boldest thing I had done in 20 years, and I did it the only way a man in my place could, quietly, and through the one door that was open to me. I did not go to the provost. I have told you why. I went to old Mr. Pell. I found him in the clerk's room below, white as paper, his hands shaking, because he had already been told, Krail had seen to that his late Majesty's private testament had been found in his keeping, and that he was to carry it to the council and stand by while it was read. The poor man had no idea what was in it. He only knew the Lord High Steward had handed him a sealed packet and a noose in the same breath, and called it an honor. He looked up at me in the doorway, a guard out of his place at an hour he had no business being there, and he said, "Sergeant, cold one, out of habit, out of fear." I crossed to him and I told him, low and fast and plain, the way I would have made a field report, everything I knew. The seal, the false laurel on the lower left, the foreigners and the dates, the king abed those nights, the revenues bled east, and the draft which I drew out from against my heart and put into his trembling hands, with Krail's own line at the foot in Krail's own hand, that the rope, if it came, was meant for Pell. He read it. He read it the way I had read it, 3 times though once was enough, and the shaking went out of his hands, and something came into the old man's face that I had not expected and have never forgotten, not fear now, but a kind of terrible steadiness. He had served the house of Marin for 40 years. He had been made a fool of and a sacrifice, and he had just been handed, by a guard he had thought of only ever as a lonely man on a cold post, the means to stand up straight. "They will not believe a clerk," he said, "nor a sergeant." "No," I said, "they will not believe either of us alone, but you carry the seal of the closet and the council knows your hand, and you can demand that the privy seal, the true one, the one on his late Majesty's person, be brought and broken open and laid beside the wax on that letter. You can ask that one thing, and it is your right to ask it, and no one can refuse a clerk of the closet that. And I will be in that room against the wall where the furniture stands. And if they ask who saw, you have only to point." He looked at me a long moment. "And if it costs us," he said, "him as he is and us as we are." "It will cost us nothing it has not already tried to cost you," I said. "And I have stood at that door every dead hour of this winter so that one morning I could stand here and say what I saw. That is the whole of my trade, Mr. Pell, standing still until the standing means something. That is the closest I have ever come to a speech in my life. I will not pretend I made it into that chamber by right. The night guard has no place at the Privy Council, but a great house in the first hour of a king's death is a house in disarray, and a guard in correct dress who walks with purpose to a doorway and takes a post beside it, eyes forward, as if he had been ordered there, is the last thing any man in the middle of a crisis stops to question. I walked the length of the floor I had guarded all winter, and I took up my place inside the council chamber door, against the dark paneling, 3 paces from the great table, with my rifle at my shoulder and my chin against the strap, and my face the face of a thing that had always been there. I made myself scenery one last time. No one looked at me twice. They never had. The council was a dozen grey lords and the Prince Edric, newly come and out of his depth, sitting at the foot with grief and confusion plain on his honest face. And at the head, where the king's chair stood empty and draped, was the Lord High Steward, Sebastian Crail, in black, magnificent and grave, his voice never once needing to rise. He spoke of the realm's peril. He spoke of the late king's foresight. And then he turned, with sorrow beautifully arranged on his long, clean face, and he called for the clerk of the closet to bring forward his late majesty's private testament, found, alas, only that morning in the keeping of his trusted servant. Old Mr. Pell came forward with the sealed packet in his 2 hands. He set it on the table, and then, instead of stepping back to be hanged, he straightened the half-inch he had been bent for 40 years, and he said, in a clerk's dry, carrying voice, "My lords, before this is read in his late majesty's name, I claim the right of my office. I ask that the king's true privy seal, the seal upon his person, that I myself locked away at his death this very night, be brought and broken, and its impression laid beside the wax upon this letter, so that no man here and no man hereafter can say the council took the realm on a doubtful seal." There was a silence. It was the right of his office, and it was so reasonable and so plainly honest that not one of those grey lords could refuse it without seeming to fear the answer. And I watched Sebastian Crail's long, clean face, and I saw the thing I had seen once before, months ago, in the candlelight at the cabinet door. The small check, the half-second glance back at the dog he was not quite sure was asleep. Only now there was no dog to check on. There was only an old clerk standing straight, and a sealed packet, and a true seal being sent for. The true seal came. It was brought in on a cushion by the king's own valet, the genuine privy seal of the house of Marin, and it was pressed into fresh wax there on the table before them all, and the fresh impression was laid beside the seal on Crail's letter, and the grey lords leaned in. I could have told them what they would find. The fresh impression had the small break in the laurel on the lower left, the chip that had been in the true matrix for a generation. The letter's seal did not. The 2 laurels did not match. And once a man's eye has been shown that one small thing, he cannot unsee it, and a low sound went through the council like wind through dry grass, and Sebastian Crail's beautiful voice, for the first time in his life, was a half-second too slow to reach the room. "A clerk's error in the sealing," he began. "It signifies nothing." "Then it will signify nothing," said Mr. Pell, "that the letter directs the Eastern revenues abroad into the keeping of a foreign agent by a private will with no record in the public books, and that there is a draft of just such a letter, in the Lord High Steward's own hand, instructing that I be made to carry it, so that if it were ever found, it would be found in my keeping." And he laid the crumpled draft beside the false letter, and the 2 hands were the same, and the line at the foot was there for any lord to read. Crail stood. To do him a strange justice, he did not bluster. He was too clever for that. He understood, faster than any man in the room, that the architecture had come down, and he reached, the way such men always reach at the last, for the one thing that might still be true. He looked at the old clerk and he said, with the contempt that had been the engine of his whole life, "And who is to say the draft is mine and not your own forgery, old man? Where is your witness? Who in this palace ever saw me do these things you say? You stood alone at that door each night. There was no one there but you and the dark." And there it was, the whole of it, asked aloud in a council of the realm, who saw. Mr. Pell did not answer. He did not have to. He only turned his head the smallest movement and looked toward the dark paneling beside the door where the furniture stood. And I stepped forward. I had not spoken in that room. I had not been seen in it. To every lord at that table I was, until that instant, a part of the wall, a fixture the disordered morning had set there and forgotten, the way it forgot the clock and the armor at the turn of the stair. When I took a single pace from the paneling and brought my rifle down to rest and stood at attention in the open, a dozen gray heads turned at once, and on every face was the same expression. Not fear, not yet, but bewilderment. The bewilderment of men, discovering that the room had been occupied all along. "Sergeant Thomas Wren, my lords," I said, "of the household night guard. The cabinet door, the late watch, 4 nights in 7, the whole of this winter past." I did not look at the council. I looked at Sebastian Crail, who was looking at me as a man looks at a chair that has stood up and begun to speak. And I watched, with a satisfaction I will not pretend I did not feel, the moment he placed me. The moment he remembered the furniture he had ordered to stand straighter and called a coat stand in a costume and rapped his knuckles against to test the wood. The moment he understood that there had been a man inside the thing he had decided not to see, and that the man had a memory like wet plaster, and that he, Sebastian Crail, had spent a whole winter building his betrayal 3 paces in front of it. I gave my report. I gave it the way I had given 100 reports in the field, in the cold, dry voice of a man stating what he has observed. Every date a foreigner climbed the west stair, and the hour, and what he carried down. Every night the false seal was pressed in the cabinet when the true seal was 3 corridors away on the body of a king too weak to hold it. The sounds of the wax and the knife through the open door, the small break in the laurel. And the night the Lord High Steward, in a temper over a sum that had not arrived, threw a crumpled draft toward a cold hearth and did not come back for it, because furniture does not pick things up. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I described. A man cannot argue with a description the way he can argue with an accusation. There is nothing in it to push against. I simply laid out, fact upon fact, the winter I had stood and watched, and as I laid it out I watched the gray lords' faces change, one by one, from bewilderment to belief, because the dates fit the draft and the draft fit the seal and the seal fit the body of the dead king upstairs. And a man who has truly seen a thing does not need to embellish it, and they all heard that he had not. When I finished there was a silence in that chamber longer and deeper than any I ever stood through on the night post. And then the Prince Edric, the honest young man out of his depth, who had said nothing the whole morning, rose at the foot of the table, and he looked first at the false letter, and then at the old clerk standing straight, and then at me, and last and longest at Sebastian Crail. And he said, in a plain provincial voice that had never learned the court's smooth music and was the better for it, "Have the Lord High Steward held for the provost, and someone bring the sergeant a chair. He has been standing since 11 o'clock last night." They took Crail that morning. There was no scene. Men like that have no fight in them once the building is down. They stripped him of his white staff of office there at the table, and the provost's men came and walked him out through the very long gallery he had walked through all those nights as if the floors had been laid for his feet. And I am told, for I was not there to see it, having for once in my life accepted the chair, that he did not look at the cabinet door as he passed it. He was held for trial, and the foreigners were sought, and the Eastern revenues, most of them, were got back. And in the months that followed the new king set the books to rights with the dry help of a clerk of the closet whom he came to trust above almost any man in the kingdom. As for me, I did not become anything. I want to be clear about that, because people like a story to end with a man given a great rank, and that is not how this one ends. I was thanked privately by a king, which is no small thing, and which I keep. I was offered, I will admit, a place in the daytime in the sun on the public gate where the people gather and a guardsman's stillness is admired by the whole world. I asked instead to keep my old post, the cabinet door, the late watch. The dead hours, 4 nights in 7 in the long gallery, among the portraits, where nothing happens and no one comes and a man stands still until the standing means something. The new king thought it a strange request. Perhaps it was. But I had learned twice over in one life, the only thing I have ever been certain of, and I will give it to you now at the end, as plainly as I gave my report that morning, because it is the whole of what I know. The most dangerous man in any room is not the one at the head of the table with the white staff and the beautiful voice. It is the one everyone in the room has quietly agreed not to see. Treat a man as furniture, and he will keep your secrets, every one of them in order by date, until the morning comes when it serves a greater duty to set them down. I stood that door a long time. I never raised my hand, and I never raised my voice, and I never once moved when I was watched. And in the end, the strongest thing I ever did, the thing that brought down a man who held the keys to a kingdom, was to stand perfectly still and forget nothing, and wait for the one moment when a piece of furniture could speak.